Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Douglas, and I teach about the history and impact of the media at the University of Michigan. And today I'm going to talk about inventing broadcasting, the early history of radio. Now, in the winter and spring of 1922, magazines and newspapers discovered radio. To the press, the fad seemed to come from nowhere. It was dubbed wireless fever, and Herbert Hoover, who was then the Secretary of Commerce, proclaimed the radio boom to be, and I quote, "one of the most astounding things that has come under my observation in American life." Never in the history of electricity has an invention so gripped the popular fancy, enthused the magazine Review of Reviews. The New York Times proclaimed, "In 12 months, radio phoning has become the most popular amusement in America." So this was a huge phenomenon. You can see the sales figures here indicating the incredibly rapid adoption of radio from 60 million in 1922 to 358 million in 1925. And at this time, these were not even complete sets. You had to assemble them yourself. But despite radio being touted as having risen from obscurity, radio, of course, did not come from nowhere. It had been developing for over 20 years. So how was radio broadcasting invented, and what would be its impact? So radio was not just invented and poof, entered people's homes. Radio and its uses and impact resulted, of course, from technical developments, from business strategies, from government regulations, from how the press depicted the device, and most importantly, how everyday people over time made use of it. So radio was socially constructed by many actors and many events. Now, ever since James Clerk Maxwell in 1865 posited that accelerated changes in electric and magnetic forces would send waves spreading through space, scientists worked to test that theory. And in 1888, the German scientist Heinrich Hertz, he did just that. He produced and generated the waves that Maxwell had predicted, and he affirmed that they moved at the speed of light. So to do this, he used an induction coil to generate electrical oscillations. The electricity passed from the induction coil up through rods on each end, which were attached to perpendicular brass rods, which you can see here. On the outside end of the rods were attached metal spheres, and on the inside edge, as you can see here, was a rod with a hollow metal ball. He applied high voltage electricity across what was called the spark gap, the gap between A and B, and created sparks. Hertz reasoned that if Maxwell was right, these sparks would generate electromagnetic waves. To test this, he stood several feet away with a simple receiver of looped wire. At the ends of the loop were small knobs, separated again by a tiny gap. When he turned on the oscillator, it produced sparks in the receiver. Hertz thus discovered radio waves. They were, in fact, initially known as Hertzian waves, and they allegedly moved through a medium called the ether. Now, Hertz's work was widely publicized, and it prompted many scientists and inventors to build on his work. The most successful was a young Irish-Italian tinkerer, Guglielmo Marconi. His mother, of the whiskey-producing Jameson family, especially encouraged his experimentation, and he determined to extend the power and the distance of the device. He was not experimenting with the lecture hall in mind. He wanted to produce a practicable, commercially successful system of communication, and he meant to have the thing pay. Marconi, seen here with his assistant George Kemp, had a simple business model. His service would be just like the telegraph, but without wires. His system would transmit the Morse code, and he devised a receiver that printed out the dots and dashes on a paper tape that you can see here. He continued to work to extend the distance of his system, and he conducted demonstrations in Britain, between offshore islands and the mainland. Publicity was key here to becoming successful, getting investors and starting a company. Now, in 1898, he had covered the progress of the Kingstown Regatta in England, which was very closely watched. And by the spring of 1899, he had actually successfully transmitted across the English Channel. By now, Marconi had come to the attention of the notorious publisher of the New York Herald, James Gordon Bennett, who was also an avid yachtsman. Now, he offered Marconi $5,000, a lot of money back then, to cover the America's Cup races for the New York Herald in October of 1899. Now, Marconi, of course, eager to demonstrate his device wherever he could, readily accepted. Now, the yacht races were a major event and a major spectacle in New York Harbor back then. People crowded on excursion boats and lined the coast to follow what was a heated competition between America's Columbia and Ireland's Shamrock. Marconi installed a transmitter on a small steamship and a receiver at the Herald's offices in the city. Now, each update of the progress of the race was posted on bulletin boards outside the Herald's office to traffic blocking crowds awaiting the news. The Herald, of course, publicized its role in bringing this amazing new invention to the U.S., and the transmissions were proclaimed an overwhelming and a miraculous success. This was the era of the inventor hero, Edison, Bell, Ford. And the press quickly proclaimed Marconi such a hero, a self-made man whose system was magical and who was hailed as a new public benefactor. Now, today, we're surrounded by so many communications technologies. It can be hard to appreciate how miraculous wireless seemed to people. The New York Times gushed, and I quote from them, "We are learning to launch our winged words." There was a lot of flowery language around radio. And that you could send messages through the air without any connection at all, without wires. It was truly wondrous to people. All sorts of wistful and wishful predictions came forth. The Times, for example, saw a time when, quote, "wireless telegraphy would make a father on the old New England farm and his son in Seattle neighbors, perhaps by the use of their own private apparatus," end quote. Some cast wireless as the technical equivalent of telepathy. So the reception of this invention was pretty rapturous. Now you have to remember the major gaps in communication systems in 1899. When commercial or naval ships were out at sea, they used smoke signals or homing pigeons to communicate with the shore or nearby ships. But once those were out of sight, the ships were incommunicado, which was, of course, a danger. Islands without undersea cables connecting them to the mainland, they were in the same situation. So Marconi saw ocean liners and navies as potentially very important and lucrative customers. Marconi also knew that Western Union and the Atlantic cable companies were some of the most hated and resented monopolies in the country. This is a political cartoon of Jay Gould, one of the most unscrupulous robber barons of the late 19th century, who had gained control of Western Union. The press especially hated them for charging what they regarded as exorbitant rates, especially for transatlantic news. So Marconi's ultimate goal was to develop wireless equipment so powerful that it could actually span the Atlantic, which he claimed to do in 1901 and again in 1903. And the press heralded this because they wanted Marconi to succeed. Now, Marconi's business model was this: point-to-point communication from point A to point B. His customers would be newspapers, navies, shipping lines. Broadcasting, as we know it and think of it, this was not part of his scheme, not part of his business model at all. Now, as you know, the problem with this business model is point to point is not how radio works. Marconi quickly faced competition here from Reginald Fessenden, who was a Canadian inventor who came to the United States. And so let me describe Marconi's system a little bit. His system, you remember the sparks and the spark gaps. His system relied on bursts of energy out of the spark gap. And those bursts of energy can only carry dots and dashes. But Fessenden wanted to develop continuous waves that could actually carry music and voice. With backers, he established his own company and worked on what he called an alternator to generate continuous waves. And on Christmas Eve in 1906, he broadcast his voice and him playing violin, and some stunned shipboard operators actually heard his voice and music on their radio sets, on their wireless sets. And here is his station in Brant Rock, Massachusetts. He too hoped to span the Atlantic. Another competitor was Lee DeForest. He also envisioned broadcasting, especially of music. He worked on the reception of continuous waves, and he developed what he called the Audion, which was the antecedent to the vacuum tube. He also set up bogus wireless companies because he wanted to make money out of it. And he did dramatic demonstrations and made major claims for the device and its future. And he sold millions of dollars in worthless stock, for which he was eventually indicted. Now, meanwhile, in 1906, an Army officer and inventor who was working with DeForest discovered that the mineral carborundum, a compound of silicon and carbon, which was manufactured as a crystal, worked as a detector of radio waves. Inventors didn't understand or know how it worked, but it was durable. And more to the point, it was expensive. Now you can see here that a thin wire known as the cat's whisker made contact with the mineral, and it could be moved because some spots on the crystal were more sensitive than others. The signals were heard, as you can see here, through earphones. Now the impact of the introduction of the crystal set cannot be overemphasized. It democratized wireless, and it gave rise to a whole new group of users known as the amateur operators, and later, as we know them today, as ham operators. Hundreds and then thousands of mostly white middle-class boys and men took to this pastime, took to this hobby. They began building wireless stations in their garages, bedrooms, attics. They were most prevalent in urban and especially coastal areas. They were incredibly ingenious. They used all sorts of electrical and metal cast-offs to create their sets. The brass spheres from an old bedstead served as the spark gap, for example, and the metal ribs from a cast-off umbrella were crafted into an antenna. Now, the one component that was too complicated to duplicate and too expensive for most to buy were the headphones, the headphone set. Consequently, headphone sets began vanishing from public telephones around the country. Now, by 1910, various navies had adopted wireless, as had many cruise lines. Marconi also sold his service to newspapers. Nonetheless, by 1910, there were hundreds of high-powered amateur stations with highly skilled operators. Navy and commercial stations, they comprised only 15-20% of the total. Some amateur stations could send and receive for up to 300 or 400 miles, and many, ignoring patents, had developed more sophisticated tuning. Now, the amateur operators loved listening into naval and commercial transmissions. They also gossiped with each other. They shared their homework assignments. They shared football scores. They also communicated with shipboard operators who worked long hours and were often bored. Some, however, were the hackers of their times. They would send false or obscene messages, especially to naval operators for whom they had little respect. They dispatched naval ships, posing sometimes as admirals on all sorts of fabricated missions, like saying that a ship was sinking off the coast. Now, after searching in vain, the Navy would learn the truth. The ship had, in fact, arrived safely in port. And as you can imagine, this was an enormous and growing nuisance to the Navy. Now, at the same time, the press, including newspapers and magazines, as well as juvenile literature, began celebrating the amateur operators as boy wonders. Here's one such boy hero, W.E.D. Stokes, the first president of the Junior Wireless Club. Now, these hams, they did form clubs all over the country, and gradually an informal wireless network was established. Radio wasn't regulated, tuning was often poor, so interference increased, and this was a problem, especially for the Navy and the commercial companies. So this was the state of wireless in 1910. It had now been part of America's cultural and economic landscape for a decade. Its use hadn't been regulated in any way, as it had been in Europe. So why did we eventually get broadcast regulation and regulation of the airwaves? There's a simple answer: shipwrecks. The first disaster was the dramatic and highly publicized collision of this ship, the White Star liner, the Republic, with another, the Florida, which rammed it off the foggy coast of Nantucket in January of 1909. The Republic was taking well-to-do Americans to the Mediterranean, and it had wireless on board. The Florida, bringing hundreds of Italian immigrants to New York, did not. Now, between the two of them, the ships were carrying over 1,200 people. The Republic started sinking, and crews from both ships began transferring passengers to the Florida. But the Florida was half the size of the Republic, so it wasn't clear whether it could hold such a heavy load. The Republic's wireless operator began frantically sending distress signals. The Baltic was the first to arrive, and it took on all the passengers from both ships. The press was breathless. "What a wonderful tale it is," effused Harper's Magazine, "and how deeply moving. The cry for help thrown into the air from a mast tip and caught 100 miles and more away. Wireless has robbed accident by sea of half its terrors." And Jack Binns, the Republic's wireless operator, became an instant hero, celebrated for sticking to his post and, as Putnam's magazine put it, sending until he nearly collapsed. And you can see Saved by Wireless, and the dominant distress signal at the time was CQD, which stood for CQ danger. When the Republic's engine room flooded and the power went off, Binns switched to reserve batteries until help arrived. And you can see this headline: "Drenched and hungry, he stuck to his key in wreck of the Marconi room. He dived for new batteries. When the old ones were rendered useless, the operator was a nervous wreck." By the time he got to New York, Binns was lionized, hounded for interviews, and offered $1,000 a week to appear on vaudeville. Wireless, always cast as a wonder in the press, this was now an heroic invention. And the accident drove home the need for wireless regulation. Having wireless, it was now a matter of life and death. And so Congress enacted the Wireless Ship Act of 1910. So ships sailing into or out of U.S. ports with 50 or more passengers and plying between ports 200 more miles apart had to have wireless apparatus in good working order. They had to be able to receive and send over a distance of 100 miles. But a much more important and, of course, notorious shipwreck was to come. In April 10th, 1912, the Titanic set sail with 2,200 people aboard. As everybody knows, on the night of April 14th and 15th, the Titanic hit an iceberg. On April 15th, the New York Times and other papers reported that the Titanic had hit an iceberg, but was still afloat and was being towed to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And you can see the headlines here: Titanic's passengers saved, all saved from Titanic. Thus, few were prepared for the horrifying headlines. The next day, the Titanic sinks under 4 hours after hitting an iceberg. 866 rescued by the Carpathia, probably 1,250 perish. Jack Phillips, one of the Titanic's wireless operators, began sending CQDs and a more recent distress signal, SOS. He started sending those signals frantically at 10:25 p.m. New York time. Ships in the Titanic's vicinity never heard these calls, although ships as far as 12 hours away did. Why? Some ships didn't have wireless at all. The California, there's a map here of what ships were in the area. The California was less than 20 miles from the Titanic, but its only wireless operator, because they only had one, he was asleep. Also, the captain had shut down the ship's engines, which powered the wireless apparatus. Now, had the California gotten the signals, everyone could have been saved. Now, one ship, the Carpathia, was 58 miles away, and it caught the distress signals by a completely lucky fluke. Its operator, Harold Cottam, he'd finished his work for the night, but he had gone back to the wireless room to verify what's called a time rush, just checking the time between two ships, and he caught the distress signals. The Carpathia immediately headed for the Titanic, but it was too far away to get there in time to save everybody. Jack Phillips continued to send distress signals even after the ship told him to abandon ship, and he went down with the ship. He became a legend, and statues were erected on both sides of the Atlantic to commemorate his courage. Harold Bride, the surviving Titanic operator, helped man the Carpathia station and became a national hero. More than 1,500 people died, between 800 and 900 survived, mostly women and children. You can see Bride being carried off the ship because he had frostbite in his feet. Now, what happened was that there was an enormous reaction against the hams. That message, all Titanic passengers safe, towing to Halifax. The hams were accused of fabricating that message maliciously. Now, investigation subsequently showed that was probably not the case. There was a lot of interference, and there was actually another ship that was being towed to Halifax. And so the two messages, Titanic hits an iceberg and another ship getting towed to Halifax, got mashed up. And it was a mistake. But now there was a recognition that there had to be further wireless regulation to save lives. But now there was a crucial shift. There was an understanding that the airwaves were a common property resource. We all had a stake in its use to save lives. This was a huge story, as you know, and wireless was its main star. Marconi was deified in the press. Some editorials gave him sole credit for saving the lives of the Titanic survivors. Ensuring the safety of the airwaves was now crucial. So the Radio Act of 1912 was enacted. Now all operators had to be licensed. Stations had to adhere to certain wavelength allocations. Distress calls took priority over all other calls, and one wavelength, the 300-meter band, was reserved solely for distress calls. The Secretary of Commerce and Labor was empowered to issue those licenses, and the amateurs were kicked down to the short waves, 200 meters and below, because at the time it was thought that the short waves were worthless and that the longer the waves, the farther they traveled. There were fines established for malicious interference and for sending fake distress calls. Ships with 50 or more passengers had to now have at least 2 skilled wireless operators, so there was somebody on duty at all times. And there had to be auxiliary power for wireless when the ship's regular power was shut off. This was a watershed in broadcasting history. The spectrum was recognized as a common property resource, a commons, and a trustee model was set up. The government became a trustee that managed and regulated the spectrum for users. There was no private ownership of the airwaves, but public good was a top priority. So with a common property resource, all have equal rights to these resources. It's a common good, like rivers, like oceans, like mountains. No one should own them. And a recognition that overuse by one or some reduces the availability and the value to all, like overfishing or overgrazing. So you had to restrict the number of users. Now, the hams did not go away. In fact, their numbers only increased. The portion of the Radio Act affecting them was actually very poorly enforced. So many ignored the law, but they sought to operate with more discretion, especially near naval stations. They learned that the 200-meter wavelength assignment was not ironclad, and they could move up to 300 or 400 meters without getting into trouble. Now, in 1914, the radio enthusiast Hiram Percy Maxim founded the American Radio Relay League. He got the Secretary of Commerce to grant special licenses for certain stations at strategic points across the country, and he began demonstrating countrywide message relays to show that the hams could be responsible and that they constituted a legitimate communications network. The number of hams continued to grow, and this would be very important for broadcasting. Now, when the U.S. entered World War I, the hams, who were often very experienced already, they joined the Signal Corps, and many needed minimal or no training given their expertise. And this also, again, burnished the reputation of the amateur operators. There were further improvements in radio technology during the war, especially a refinement of the vacuum tube. And this, one of the discoveries was that the vacuum tube could not only be a receiver, it could also be a transmitter of radio waves. And this led to experimental post-war broadcasting by a few ham operators, especially those who had come home with vacuum tubes. Now, what happened? Other hams started to listen. And now what they were hearing was voice and music. And this, again, really seemed miraculous, and a desire to hear this spread. Now, after the war, there was a concern that the British-controlled American Marconi Company should no longer monopolize commercial radio communication in the United States. The Navy wanted to take over the radio, but there was public and congressional opposition. So with General Electric taking the lead, the Marconi Company was bought out, and RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, was formed. Now, it's important to emphasize that its vision was the same as Marconi's: long distance point-to-point communication. You can see here, worldwide wireless. But of course, that's not what happened. I mean, it's one of the things, but it's not the main thing that happened. Hams continued to listen in and broadcast, forming the incipient broadcast audience. One such ham was Frank Conrad, an engineer for Westinghouse. He started playing phonograph records from his station. Other amateurs praised him, and they sent in requests for songs. He began scheduling these on a regular basis, first on Saturday nights, and then he expanded to weeknights as well. The amateurs, so, were not just hearing Morse code anymore. They were hearing voice and music, and they could introduce their parents, their friends, and siblings to the excitement of radio. The audience for broadcasting was growing even bigger. Now, a Pittsburgh department store hoping to increase its sales of amateur apparatus, ran an ad describing the wireless concerts that Conrad was doing. When a Westinghouse vice president saw the ad, he realized the company's and RCA's conception of the market had been way too limited in scope. He grasped that the amateurs were not some small discrete market, but the forerunners of a much larger market. So Westinghouse built a much more powerful transmitting station and had Conrad broadcast on an even more regular basis. KDKA, the pioneer broadcasting station in the country, went on the air in November 1920. Now, over the next year and a half, the broadcasting boom swept the country. And once again, the word miracle was the most prevalent word used. The boom seemed so sudden because the press had neglected radio between 1915 and 1920. Stations were set up by department stores, by newspapers, by colleges and universities, by city governments, and companies like AT&T. A sense of awe suffused so much of the commentary. Predictions included that the device, enabling people to hear other parts of the country or the same broadcasts at the same time, would produce cultural unity and national solidarity. And you can see here the excitement of, can we hear those blues from Memphis? There was a hope that political news would come in faster and that more people would become politically informed and that politicians would need to be made more straightforward and couldn't exploit the energy of large mobs and crowds. Those who didn't yet have radio would crowd outside of shops to listen to broadcasts. Some were so bewildered by how radio worked that they sought to find the little people inside the apparatus that was making it sing and talk. To many writers, it was as if a fantastic dimension that people had suspected and hoped existed had been penetrated. People heard static and other sounds in their earphones. As one writer put it, quote, "You are fascinated and awestruck to realize that you are listening to sounds that were never intended to be heard by a human being," end quote. Some suggested that these sounds were signals from Mars. There was enormous optimism that, in addition to enriching people with entertainment, that radio would have enormous educational possibilities with, as one writer put it, radio universities educating the world. Early listening among hams involved what was called DXing, or distance listening, listening not for what was being broadcast, but for the call letters they could collect from around the country. DXing at night was possible because AM transmissions benefit both from ground and ground wave propagation. Ground waves follow the curvature of the Earth before dissipating. And AM also benefits from skywave propagation. At night, you see here the lower levels of the ionosphere, the D and E layers, they disappear at night. And the layers above them act like a mirror, which can bounce the waves back anywhere from 100 miles to 1,500 miles away. Hams would thus listen for call letters, and once they heard them, they would put a tack on a map where the station was and move on to try to find the next station that they could hear. So what were people hearing on the radio? It was a total hodgepodge. There was no scheduled programming in the 1920s. There were lectures about the merits of the Boy Scouts. There were mini plays. There were operatic contraltos. Amateurs or professionals would come in and play the piano or the violin. And some of them did so because they were performing maybe at nearby hotels or clubs, and they thought that maybe performing on radio would be good publicity for people then to come and see or hear their shows. And in some places, like Chicago or New York, listeners got to hear black jazz bands like Louis Armstrong's band here. And the interesting thing about this is that because radio denied sight to its audience, African-American musicians could get on some stations, and many people loved this music. As early as 1923, fans could hear Graham McNamee, a pioneering sports announcer, broadcasting the World Series in New York, which again was thrilling to people. So in the early 1920s, there was no scheduled programming. At first, people did perform for free. And initially, it was thought that the sales of equipment might support those stations owned by department stores or corporations like Westinghouse or AT&T. Now, some stations broadcast the music off of phonograph records until ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, demanded royalties. So how was radio going to be supported? How could you make the thing pay? In 1925, Radio Broadcast ran a contest. Who is to pay for broadcasting and how? Proposals included listener contributions, support by philanthropy, a government licensing system, a straight up tax on vacuum tubes, a tax on other aspects of radio apparatus. What was the least popular idea? Advertising. Now, despite the opposition to advertising on radio, that it was a total invasion of a man's castle, WEAF in New York, which was owned by AT&T, began experimenting with it and showed that it paid. And you can see in this cartoon the initial alarm at people's homes being invaded by all kinds of promotions for various and sundry products. Now, at first, listeners got what was called indirect advertising. Entertainment groups were named after products, like the Happiness Boys, who promoted happiness candies. So they never said buy happiness candies, but they were meant to be generating goodwill and that you would buy happiness candies because you liked the Happiness Boys. Same with the Clico Club Eskimos, who promoted Clico Club Ginger Ale. Such shows, which brought more professional entertainment to listeners, generated goodwill for the products without directly flogging the products. But indirect advertising reduced the opposition to direct advertising. In 1926, the first network, NBC, was formed by RCA, and this was designed to link stations that could broadcast common programming. CBS was formed a year later. Networks meant that there could be centralized programming produced in New York with major vaudeville and singing stars that could be shared with affiliates that didn't have the money to produce such high-cost shows. So we got the radio boom of the 1920s. Now, there were at the time only two designated wavelengths or frequencies. And so, as you can imagine, there was massive interference. Tuning was complicated and required many dials. There was lots of pirating of radio stations. By the mid-1920s, Chicago had over 40 radio stations, and some of them pirated the wavelengths from Canada. Some of them interfered with each other. And by 1926, listening was getting very difficult because of this level of interference. So the interference became so irritating that Herbert Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce, who you may remember from the Radio Act of 1912, was authorized to designate frequencies. And he started designating them for commercial stations. But the courts deemed that the Radio Act of 1912 did not give him the authority to do so with commercial and other broadcasting stations. So we got the Radio Act of 1912, which is a template for the FCC in 1934. The Federal Radio Act of 1927 was again a trustee model, and it was based on what was then spectrum scarcity. Remember, there was only the AM band at this point. Broadcasters could use frequencies, but they could not own them, and radio stations had to operate in the public interest, convenience, or necessity. So a precedent was set. The stations with the most sophisticated and expensive transmitters, and thus backed by the most money, got the best slots on the AM dial. Educational stations dropped from 98 in 1927 to 43 in 1933, just 7% of stations. By the early 1930s, the networks had expanded significantly, growing their number of affiliates across the country. So here's a radio map of the Columbia Broadcasting System. And again, this map seeks to show the diversity of the country, but how it was united by radio. By the early 1930s, with high-priced vaudeville stars coming to radio, direct advertising, as well as product placement in shows, funded radio broadcasting, with many shows actually produced by ad agencies themselves. This was the golden age of radio from roughly 1930 to 1948, and you can see some of radio's stars here, Burns and Allen, Bing Crosby, etc. Now, there were many reasons why radio was so beloved. During the Depression, when times were tight for millions, it brought free entertainment and news into people's homes. It helped people feel connected to an imagined community, to feel something that they were part of something bigger than themselves. And in a culture flooded with images on billboards, in magazines, the movies, radio brought orality and the pleasure of listening to millions of Americans. Now, there was a real cognitive pleasure here in constructing your own image of Jack Benny's vault, or the shadow, or the pitch of a baseball being thrown. You got to use your imagination and create your own mental pictures that were yours. They were yours because you created them. And listeners knew, even if they didn't acknowledge it consciously, that they were doing the same kind of cognitive, imaginative work that millions of others were doing as well. This, too, was a collective act that helped bind the nation together despite all of the factions and fractions of the Great Depression. So, what was the impact of radio? Especially during the Depression, despite widespread labor unrest and deep economic uncertainty, it did help develop a national culture, and it did tie people together around news and entertainment. It did bring political leaders into people's homes and allowed Roosevelt, who was extremely skilled with radio, to calm and reassure people during the Depression and World War II. And people thought that the fireside chats sounded so spontaneous and relaxed, but they were massively rehearsed so that they would sound spontaneous and relaxed. Radio brought racist representations into people's homes, like Amos and Andy was a show enacted by two white men in blackface who trafficked in all kinds of made-up malapropisms that they attributed to Black folks. Show was very controversial. There were Black listeners who hated it, and there were Black listeners who loved it. But radio also brought Black musicians like Louis Armstrong, Bessie Smith, and Duke Ellington into white people's homes, generating white fandom for Black music and culture. Radio made listening to music an everyday constituent part of people's lives. And this was especially important for men because prior to the 1920s, music appreciation was seen as a feminine pastime. And once jazz came on radio, men became more engaged in music listening, and it became a more constitutive part of their lives as well. Radio created national markets for all sorts of products and brought commercials and commercialism right into people's homes, whether people liked it or not. It brought us demagogues like Father Coughlin. It brought us gossip mongers like Walter Winchell, who blended hard news with celebrity journalism, thus blurring the lines between news and celebrity culture, something we are very much living with today. It also brought us heroic journalists like Edward R. Murrow, who really helped create radio broadcast journalism and on the scene broadcasting with his famous This Is London broadcasts. Radio brought us gifted singers like Billie Holiday. It brought us talent. It brought us heroism. It brought us crassness, and it brought us opportunism. Radio tapped into and brought the country some of the best and some of the worst that it had to offer. Of course, there's much more one could say about radio and its impact, but a device initially designed to send the Morse code through the air without wires, designed specifically for point-to-point communication, for which it was ill-suited. Through the work of various inventors, and especially the practices and vision of the ham operators who constituted the first broadcasting audience, wireless became radio, the dominant mass medium from the late 1920s until the early 1950s. And it paved the way for the next, even more dominant medium, television, which has had equally beneficial and unfortunate consequences. Thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions or comments you might have. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to the talk. And there are some questions in the chat that I will go through and seek to answer in the time that we have. So the first question is, were there any notable women who contributed to the early days of radio? Not really. This was engineering and technological tinkering was very much seen as a masculine activity and a masculine pastime. So it was very, very white male dominated. However, Lee DeForest's first wife, Lee DeForest, who developed the precursor to the vacuum tube, did meet and fall in love with Nora Stanton Blatch. And Nora Stanton Blatch was the great-granddaughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she did actually have some engineering training. And she did sought to help him develop some of his, devices. But when it became clear that he was, kind of using radio, I mean, he was interested in the technology, but he really wanted to use radio to get rich quick. And so once that became his overriding passion, she left him. Please comment on the dominance of certain internet and cable TV companies and the relation to the notion that the airwaves are for the common good. This is a great question. It used to be, really from the enactment of the Federal Radio Commission and then the FCC up until the 1980s, and especially in certain eras, the 1940s, then again in the 1970s, there was the FCC was somewhat activist in really trying to ensure that people were exposed to both sides of a controversial issue, that they be well informed, that there be public programming, because the notion of, the common good prevailed. And during the 1980s, under Ronald Reagan's FCC, there was a real move to deregulate much of what's going on in the airwaves. It was seen that the market was the best arbiter of how, the airwaves should be managed and how ownership should be governed. And so the Fairness Doctrine, for example, that had required that, if one side of an issue was presented, The station had to also guarantee an opposing side. All of that went away. And, now with the proliferation of so many, as the questioner notes, so many cable channels, so many streaming services, we're awash in all of this stuff, and it is so commercially and market driven. A lot of the notion of the common good and the spectrum as a common property resource, I personally think has really gone away. Someone asked if I had read Thunderstruck by Erik Larson about Marconi and whether it's based on a true history. And I regret to say I can't answer that because I haven't read the book. Now, have podcasts and music streaming services replaced radio? Do you think the communal aspect has been lost in favor of more individually curated audio entertainment? Well, there was a period in the early 2000s when many of us radio historians and sound studies people really thought that an interest in sound had attenuated, that, radio had gotten so commercialized with all of these different formats. And then the podcast serial happened. And a lot of people listened to that. And then we started to get an explosion of podcasts. And the questioner is right that we are getting more individually curated audio entertainment, but some of these podcasts do reach a pretty broad audience, and some of them are, meant for entertainment and titillation. There are a whole bunch of, murder podcasts that explore past murders and speculate about them. There are obviously political podcasts. There are podcasts by news organizations that actually quite a few people listen to. And there are also podcasts that are produced by and for marginalized communities like African Americans, where kinds of news and commentary that don't exist in the mainstream media can exist. Another person asked, how did authorities track down the more malicious radio amateurs? This was really hard. It was not easy to do that because there was an anonymity. So it was very hard to get caught. And actually, I found no record. Now, that doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I found no record of any individual amateurs in the teens, in the lead up to the Titanic and afterwards getting caught. They were using telegraph keys, and so some listeners who were very, very sharp-eared, and this was true in telegraph as well, could tell what was called the fist of the operator, because certain people had a certain style of messaging. That could be one way that certain malicious amateurs could have gotten caught, but very few of them did. It was anonymous, because these stations, they didn't have call letters or anything back then. Could you comment on the many parallels between the development of radio and that of the internet? Oh boy. In the mid 1990s, when there was so much idealism around the internet that it was going to be a new public sphere, that it was going to flatten hierarchies, that was going to take on the dominant media, which was very top down, very one to many. All of these incredibly idealistic visions for the internet. Those of us who are radio historians were like, yeah, just wait. I think it's going to become a strip mall, because how are all of these platforms going to be supported? And of course, what we know now, it's the same history that happened with radio. How do you make it pay? And the tradition in our country going back to the telegraph, when after the first telegraph line was demonstrated by Morse, the Congress decided that they were not going to support the telegraph and have it be, a government-funded form of communication. And, ever since then, they've been private entities. So, there were ways in which radio first started that seemed so democratic and so democratized and could potentially include a range of voices, especially with hams who were, broadcasting. But that, got shut down pretty quickly with the networks. And I think that's something similar that's happened to the internet. Great question. Is it true that David Sarnoff, eventually the head of RCA, was an important receiver of the Titanic distress calls? According to David Sarnoff, he was. This was a story that he really burnished, that he was a Marconi operator, that he was one of the main people who was tracking that disaster, that he was the one relaying messages, and he really blew his role quite out of proportion to what was going on. There were actually, the hams had, of course, been instantly chastened by the notion of this, initially thought malicious message, but many of them were actually really, really trying to help. And David Sarnoff was not the only one of them doing that. He was involved, but he blew his role quite out of proportion. There was a certain element that his biographers would certainly say about David Sarnoff, who after a while insisted on being called the general. So let's see. I don't have any more questions yet. Let's see if there's anything else that I've missed here. Okay, your comments on men becoming interested in music once jazz musicians, men, received greater recognition is really interesting. Once a technology becomes powerful, do men take charge? That seems to be the case in many areas. Now, the interesting thing here is that really in the up to the late 19 teens, music appreciation and concert going, that was seen to be what women did. In many homes, it was women who were supposed to learn how to play the piano to entertain the family. It was women who mostly went to concerts, and men didn't so much. And so when radio began playing music, and in the early years, especially in a city like Chicago, two kinds of music dominated. There was opera and there was jazz. And you may know that once World War I broke out and New Orleans was a naval station because it was a big port, a lot of the brothels and the red light districts were closed down, which is where many jazz musicians earn their living. And so they migrated to Chicago and began performing there. And it was that kind of jazz, Fletcher Henderson, Louis Armstrong. People hadn't heard anything like it. And it was, a very lively kind of music that rested on important real skill by the musicians, whether they were playing, the trumpet or the piano. And of course, Bessie Smith became a huge star on radio as well through the blues. And so this really invited men in to appreciate this new kind of lively, very male-dominated music. Now, to your second part of your question, once a technology becomes powerful, do men take charge? Mostly, but, in so many realms of technological experimentation and engineering, they've been male dominated from the start. It was boys who were encouraged to experiment with crystal sets. Right up through the 1950s and 60s, and girls were not. And so many fields of engineering and technology start out being male dominated and continue to be so, which is why now there's such an emphasis to bring women into, STEM areas at colleges and universities. Let's see. Why doesn't the First Amendment apply to radio so that people can say anything they wish, even if it's offensive to others? So when the Federal Communication Commission was established in 1934, they were not meant to censor programming. And there was a provision called Section 315 that required that if one politician, one major politician of a party got time, then another politician would get time. After all, the people enacting the FCC were politicians themselves. But the FCC did prohibit a few kinds of speech, including obscenity and profanity, because these were airwaves, going out to families. And they, at the time, it was felt that that kind of language should be kept off the air. So this is why even today, if you have something on NBC, ABC, or CBS, you're not supposed to hear, profane language. And if you do, it gets bleeped. But on HBO, it runs rampant because that's a pay-per-view station. And even cable, not pay-per-view cable, is not as subjected to that, because again, it's thought that you're deciding yourself to watch cable channels. But many shows are, and certainly news shows, try to be very careful about their language. Okay, what about the contributions of David Sarnoff? So David Sarnoff, of course, ran RCA and then, NBC, somewhat with an iron fist. And so he has a contribution that one could regard as very important, but somewhat draconian. There began to be two major threads of really important experimentation in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And one was FM radio, frequency modulation, which was being pioneered by Edward Armstrong. And the other was television, which first began as a mechanical form and then as an electronic form. And at first, RCA was interested in both of them, but Sarnoff reasoned that to promote FM would mean that people who had just bought, radios, if FM really succeeded, and FM, of course, is a higher quality of sound, but if it succeeded, then people during the Depression would have to buy all new radio sets. So he basically squashed that research, and Armstrong, after years of patent suits and litigation, eventually killed himself over that decision. But on the other hand, it allowed Sarnoff to introduce television to America during the 1939 World's Fair. So it looks like we are out of time. These were great questions. Thank you so much for them. They covered so many different topics. And thank you so much for coming. And I hope you found the talk interesting, and have a great night.